Good day, students. Today we continue with Unit 2, a framework to engage in effective environmental analysis. This should be the final part to this unit. So today's lesson is actually a summary of information contained in the Integrated Environmental Assessment Training Manual that would have been provided as a resource earlier in the lesson. Okay, so let's move on. Right. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that we can properly define monitoring and evaluation. So when we talk about monitoring, monitoring is defined as a planned, systematic approach that closely follows a course of activities. So those would be like tasks that you're carrying out regularly. And it compares what is actually happening with what is expected. So are you meeting the expected outcomes of the particular range of tasks in a defined process? All right, so in an organization, you may have several processes. So you are regularly monitoring those various processes and measuring them against unexpected outcomes. So for example, expected outcomes may be an industry standard on a particular indicator that has been defined as best practice. So monitoring the IEA, or the Integrated Environmental Assessment process, makes sure the assessment meets its goals while working within the scope of allocated resources. So for example, whether or not you can meet your goals would often be defined by how much time do you have, what financial resources, what budget do you have, do you have the required manpower and trained and skilled personnel, information available to you, as well as technical expertise and resources. So that's important to note. Whether or not you can meet your goals would often be defined by those things. So that defines your scope. Evaluation now, on the other hand, is defined as assessing an achievement against a preset criteria. So bear in mind the achievement, what you're assessing in the achievement is at the end of a process, the end of an entire process. So we talked about monitoring as an evaluation of the process itself, whether you meet your goals. So that will be like discrete tasks within a larger process. Evaluation now happens at the end of a process. And again, here you are also measuring it against something, against a criteria or a standard. Okay, so bear in mind in both cases, you are doing some kind of comparative measurement. So evaluations can have a variety of purposes and can follow distinct methodologies. So again, at the end of a process, can you evaluate the process, the discrete outcome itself? So a particular outcome, you can evaluate that. You can also evaluate performance. So performance of very different things. There are different indicators that you would use for the performance of different things. All right. So again, it's important for you all to be aware of this, because when you're conducting any research, and in particular for your purposes at the bachelor's level, where you are required to gather primary data. In other words, you have to gather your own data, and it should be scientific or quantitative data. It means you have to measure something. And if you're measuring something, you should usually have some kind of standard against which to measure it. Okay, so you're not just measuring for measuring's sake. You need to measure it against something. So evaluation of the IEA process determines the extent to which achievements are comparable with the original intended purpose. All right. Have you met your purpose? Again, you measuring against a standard because that is the outcome you want. You want to meet that standard or better. And the evaluation process, remember, evaluation, somewhat different from monitoring. The evaluation process can also provide information that where you can learn lessons for how to improve your process, right? So lessons can be learned for the next environmental assessment or management cycle. So important note here, the statement, the evaluation of the process is first and foremost a capacity building, a capacity development opportunity, right? So oftentimes you find that if it's a cycle, you have to start the process all over again. Your evaluation, which often happens at the end of the process, is should inform you as to how to make improvements and make it better. Okay, so now throughout today's lesson, you find you will see some tables like this. Now, I am not going to spend a lot of time going through in detail every item in the table. I will just go through one or two of the items to help you make sure that you understand how to read the table. But this information is here for you as reference. So you will, the PDF that is available to you will give you an opportunity to take your time and review it. All right, so what is this table showing? It's comparing those two concepts that we just looked at, monitoring and evaluation. Okay, on the left, we have our attributes or the different dimensions that we are comparing, monitoring, this column, evaluation. So what is the main focus of each, right? So monitoring, you collect data on progress. How are you progressing through a project, right? You want to make sure that you're on track, that you're not going off track or going outside of your scope. Again, that is why you find when you have to do your project proposals, you have to clearly define your scope. Because if you do not clearly define your scope, you will find yourself going all outside of your project into places you don't want to be, right? So you're collecting data on your progress. Evaluation, on the other hand, you're assessing data at critical stages of the process. So you may find, oftentimes projects will have different phases. You may, let's say you have a project with 3 phases. You may, at the end of phase 1, you might want to do an assessment as to whether you're meeting your outcome or your criteria or standards, as the case may be, at the end of stage 2 and the end of stage 3. And then usually at the end of the project, you will do an overall evaluation. All right. Main question. What needs to happen now to reach our goal? That's why you're monitoring progress. So what is happening now? What do I need to do now? And you want to stay on track in terms of what needs to be done for monitoring. For evaluation now, question you're asking, what have we achieved? Have we achieved our goal? Because now you're at the end of it, you're looking back. So you want to know, have you achieved the goal? How can we do better next time? Remember, we talked about that. Capacity building for the next time around. I want to look at this one as well, time focus. Monitoring happens in the present. Evaluation, as we have discussed, you look backwards to see what you have done, what you have achieved. And then it also gives you, at that point, a future perspective as to how you can do better. All right. So again, I want you all to take some time and go through the rest of the table. And as I said, there will be other tables in this lesson, but we don't really have time to go through everything with a fine-tooth comb, but the information is available here to you. Okay, so we continue. Right, so key questions for developing an evaluation plan. Right, so we're running through this quickly. Questions you will need to be able to answer for the development of any plan, an evaluation plan. So you must have the purpose. Who will use the results? So who would be your audience? Who are you preparing this report for? Who will do the evaluation? You must be able, if it's an organizational setting, you must be able to identify who are the persons that will be involved or participate in the team for evaluation. What evaluation framework is practical? Guidelines, do you have guidelines available? Sometimes there may be industry standard framework or guidelines available? If not, you may have to develop one. What needs to be monitored and evaluated? Very important. Again, for your purposes as undergraduate students preparing for a final research project, you will often have to, for your research, you would often have to clearly define what it is you are going to be monitoring or measuring, because remember, monitoring and evaluation requires variables be measured. What are the steps? Number 6, what are the steps to develop a self-assessment matrix? So remember, if it's an organization, you are evaluating your organizational processes, evaluating performance, etc. So it's a self-evaluation. And number 7, how can I use the evaluation to enhance a learning culture that keeps improving my IEA process? So capacity development, again, repeated here. Okay, so here we have a nice, simple schematic diagram that shows us the place or the importance of the Global Environmental Outlook report that we would have looked at in the previous lesson. What is its place in the entire IEA process? Again, remember, IEA being Integrated Environmental Assessment Process. So that's environmental analysis we're talking about. All right, so here we have a 7-step or 7-stage process. We have the startup of our program, as we were talking about before in the previous slide, where we were looking at things like developing the plan, so that this will have to be part of your stage 1 process. Identifying what you're evaluating, what framework, who needs to be involved, what you're measuring, etc. Once you have those plans in place, stage 2, you will have to begin setting it up within your organization. Then you develop the plan in a little more detail, your scope, the design of how you will be carrying out your measurements, etc. Planning, this is where you start putting resources and everything else that you need in place. Stage 5, this is where you carry out your assessment, your data gathering, your analysis, etc. From stage 5, this is where you develop your report. And that report is what is going to contain all the information and all the analysis, evaluation, etc. From the report, somebody would take that report, do an evaluation, and make some decisions for improvement. And then again, this cycle keeps repeating, because for example, if you look at the global GEO report, we find it's something that happens cyclically. So therefore it's part of a process. It doesn't come to a finite end because it must be ongoing. Okay, so this is important for you to know. Right. Okay, so here's actually where we define some of those things, right? In a little more detail. Startup, mandate, technical capacity, these are all the things that will come in there. Institutional setup, define roles, responsibilities, scoping, clarify methodology, what in environmental indicators, what you're going to measure, planning, financial resources, human capacity. So everything is repeated here for you. Okay. Again, this is just another perspective of the entire process. So we have that 7-step IE process, and then we have it simplified here in an outer cycle, where we see that we have this from stages 1 to 4, we see planning. From stages 5 and 6, we see this is where it's actually being done. And then stage 7 is your review portion or review phase of the entire process. All right, so these are just 2 perspectives of the same thing. One is a little more detailed, that's your inner cycle, and the one on the outer cycle is a little more general. Okay, So next discussion point, learning from monitoring and evaluation. So lessons learned from IEAs help improve policy making processes, policies, and the state of the environment. So the IEA, we are saying it contributes to three improvements in three major things: policy making, the actual policy itself, and the hope and expectation is the state of the environment will also benefit in the long run. So the IEA process builds capacity for periodic policy revision through monitoring and evaluation. So every time we complete a GEO report or a state of the environment report, because a GEO report is a type of state of the environment report, the expectation is we provide enough information and understanding. Remember, we keep talking about lessons learned. We provide enough information and understanding for improvements in the entire process, where we hope to have better policy making that will eventually affect the environment positively. So capacity is built amongst individuals and organizations involved in the process. Or these would also be stakeholders that would benefit from the process. Because if you have national state of the environment reports or GEOs, the stakeholders, any stakeholders within the national environment should be able to benefit from those reports and integrate it into their decision making. Okay, now here we have somewhat of a complex schematic diagram. So let me just help you understand what's happening here, because it's really all about relationship and how different variables affect each other. So here we have our national IEA process. So we already know what this is, right? At the end of the day, it produces a report, and that report is intended to be used to improve capacity. So as we move upwards on this diagram, we should see that what we are looking at here now is the effect of this cyclical report that is produced. We expect the outcomes to be a change in the thinking and the actions of policymakers and decision makers. So you are hoping and expecting that the information and understanding provided from these scientific reports would change the thinking and understanding of the decision makers and policy makers. So if the thinking has changed, you expect that policies will change, policy making processes would be improved in the sense that it might be a little more reliant on scientific data to develop policies. And then as a result, you expect that those policy changes should have a positive effect on the environment. And finally, and ultimately, you expect that it will have a positive impact on not only the environmental health, but also human well-being, right? So this is the relationship we are looking at. Also, we can look at it from a different perspective. If you look on the right, you see the entire IE process looks at activities and output in the short term, but then more long term, you expect outcomes and purposes to be more medium and long term. All right. So hopefully you have an understanding here. Take some time to make sure you understand the relationships and dynamics of these different variables here. Very important slide. Take note. Here we have some brief examples of treaties that have been impacted by monitoring and evaluation, right? So we have continuous improvement of ozone-related international treaties. That improvement came about as a result of research-based evidence that was provided for them, and the dynamics worked very much like what we were looking at in the previous slide with that diagram. So the research reports would have provided information to improve on those policies, which resulted in these international treaties. So this involved close monitoring of ozone concentrations in the stratosphere and simulation of possible scenarios. So this was the scientific data gathering and research. And this provided a revision for international agreements as a result. Okay, so the next issue we want to look at now is we wanted to make that connection between science and policies. So communication between the cycle of scientific data collection and processing and the cycle of policy making is facilitated by the GEO type process. So if you remember when we looked at that IEA process cycle, we saw that the GEO stage came immediately after the implementation of the research, the conducting of the research, and just before the evaluation. So what you are finding here is this is actually the stage that links the two, right, between the science and the policy making. So it can take decades, however, to develop the right set of policies after the first evidence of an environmental issue. So this can be seen here, for example, the Lake Balaton in Hungary. All right, this is an example here where we can see that link between science and policy making. So the first scientific warnings of eutrophication were published in the early 1970s. The process of policy response included, right? So you have your initial unusual scientific observations. This would have triggered a scientific debate and research and data collection, etc. Once the issue had been established as actually happening and as fact, now you find the next stage would be acceptance by policymakers, because that report would have been provided at that stage immediately after step 2. That report would have been provided to policymakers for their review and understanding. Once it's accepted, the next step would be to develop policies. The policies would be developed based on the scientific findings. Then you find the next step would be to enforce the policies. And finally, step 6, a long time period, however, is required before you can actually see cumulative impact on the environment. All right, so that's something that you need to be aware of, that it can actually take a long time to see the positive impacts of that intervention. Other examples, the UK government has been publishing environmental indicators since 1996. So that's evidence that scientific research and data gathering had been ongoing for a long period of time. So those environmental indicators, those would be the specific variables that had been measured over a long period of time. All right. So the UK Sustainable Development Strategy from 1999 significantly incorporated these indicators. Headline indicators, so like major ones, this was used to communicate progress. So remember, we were talking about monitoring before, as well as evaluation. So monitoring focuses on progress. You need indicators to measure whether you are progressing toward your goal. So an interdepartmental management board coordinated those development indicators, those indicator development, I beg your pardon. So you must have specialists involved who understand the particular environmental issue to be able to come to an agreement as to what aspects of the environment, be it human, urban, ecosystem, whatever the case may be, which aspects of the environment can we measure that can be an indicator that some particular phenomenon is happening, whether it is the phenomena is changing or not, right? Last point, however, indicators were more successful in communicating progress than in policy review. All right, so the indicators were important in communication. Not so much in policy review, but in communication of the state of the environment. Another example of Hungary. So I would leave you guys to look at some of these, but the point is you have been provided with some examples here of that connection between science and policy making. Okay, so please take note, make sure that you can understand these examples. So the next major thing in this lesson that I would want to look at is what are the foundation steps for effective monitoring and evaluation? So we're going to look at these three in turn: identifying your purpose, identifying primary users, and deciding whether internal or external evaluators are best serve your purpose. Okay, so the first major one, identifying your purpose. So if your purpose is for judgment, improvement, or knowledge creation, let's look at each one very briefly. Is your purpose judgment? What is judgment? Judgment sets clear criteria and standards to judge performance of something. All right. How, in other words, how well are you this? If you're talking about a wastewater plant, how is your plant performing? Is it meeting the objectives that it was designed for? And then, of course, you would have to determine what indicators or what measures, what am I going to need to measure to judge whether it is meeting that objective or that set of criteria or standards. And again, I'm going to repeat for you guys, oftentimes you will find that there may be industry standards or criteria that might be available for which you can measure your data against. All right. So for judgment, judgment can increase the credibility of your GEO process. Now, is your purpose for improvement? This is an open-ended evaluation that measures change over time. So you're not necessarily measuring against anything, right? But you are just looking to see if every time you do an evaluation, is there improvement each time? This is often applied to cyclical activities, such as the GEO process. Remember, we saw the GEO process, or the IEA process rather, as a cycle. Is your purpose knowledge creation? This identifies emerging knowledge and insight. So this is exploratory in nature. What does this do? This increases the relevance of your GEO process. So in other words, it's exploratory, but remember the whole issue of climate change is exploratory too. So it's about fact finding in that sense. So it has an important role to play. All right, because we are still trying to grapple with the complexities of climate change to really understand what may need to be done and what can be done. So knowledge creation is important in this, from this perspective as well. Right, so we continue. Second point, identifying your primary users. So who are your users? We have different groups of persons, people who can revise the GEO process. So this would actually be your technocrats. These would be the technical persons. These are people who have the mandate, the knowledge and skills to know what is needed, what revisions are necessary, and how to do it. All right. Another group would be those who want to revise the process. Right? Who would these people be? These are people who have an invested interest in influencing the design and implementation. So these may be other stakeholders. They may or may not be technocrats, but these are people who may have interests where they are being affected by something environmental, and they feel that the GEO process does not address their particular concerns. So these are people who would want to be able to influence changes in the process. All right. But remember, the technocrats are the ones who will actually make the changes. The third point, who are the internal or external evaluators? Right, so the primary users of the evaluation may include a small internal evaluation task force, right? So that's small within your organization or agency. This may include the IEA process core team, the technocrats, managers, etc. This is which is recommended. Then there may be an external evaluator, right? These may be consultants that you bring from the outside. They may also be internal evaluators who have been working on a different project. All right. So these are people who are not intimately involved in the IEA process or the GEO process, as the case may be. So they don't know, they are not intimately acquainted with it. And also so they don't have a personal stake in it. So that's why you would want to have external evaluators so that they can give an objective view of the process. Other users, internal or external users, you have your policy makers and your decision makers, right? These are persons as well who would need to utilize the reports and be able to evaluate them as well. And finally, you have your evaluation team, which could be both external and internal. All right. So evaluation team, that is the team that will evaluate and make a determination as to the results of the report. So here we have another little, you all could use these as self-assessments. All right. Don't worry too much about this. You can just, look at the questions, and if you have time, based on what we've discussed, determine whether you can answer some of these questions. All right. So this would have been in-class discussion topics. So some of them would have been, if we had been in class face-to-face. So why do you need a plan for monitoring and evaluation of the IEA process and impact of the process at the beginning of your planning process? Why do you need it? Why do you need a plan for monitoring and evaluation? Why is improvement-oriented evaluation relevant, right? Why do we want to be able to improve having looked at the results of our IE, right? What would you state as the purpose of your evaluation, right? And you can even consider these questions, some of these questions rather, in the context of if you had to do your own student research for your bachelor's degree. Who are the potential users? Okay, so moving on. We want to look at now a framework for monitoring and evaluating a national IE process, right? So a framework or guidelines. Here, this is really a schematic. We're going to look at some of it in a little more detail, but just an overview to make sure you can understand what you're looking at. So for the IEA process, we have here at the bottom our activities and outputs, right? Notice we're moving from bottom to top. So you would look at what we call effective opportunity management, knowledge management, and timely completion, and explanations as to each of them you would find here. Opportunity management, where you're measuring communication opportunities that are being leveraged. So in other words, you are measuring how much of a communication opportunity for your evaluation or your monitoring reports how much opportunities for communication do you have? How do you measure that? Effective knowledge management, again, how do you measure that? What are you measuring? Timely completion, again, what are you measuring? And all of these will feed into the outcomes that you want, right? So this here, for example, would be the equivalent, these bottom blocks might be the equivalent of process, and the tops might be the equivalent, let's say the equivalent of evaluation at the end stage. So for example, here you might want to be looking at how do you measure effective relationship management? So what does that mean? For example, you might be looking at measuring change. How do you measure the changes in the thinking and the actions of policy and decision makers? What do you measure to be able to determine that? Right? Because this is a goal. This is what you want to achieve. Another one would be improvements in the policy. So first here, change in thinking, improvements in the policies. What do you measure? All right, those are some of the examples that we will look at moving forward. So effective knowledge management. What are some of the things we can measure? Again, these tables, I'm not going through every single item in the table, but I'm just helping you understand what is in there. So key questions. So it starts with a question. For example, what do we have here? Is the information and analysis salient or pertinent or important or of consequence for the decision makers? Because if we go back here, we see knowledge management. Is that what we're looking at? Yes, knowledge management. Knowledge management. These are the things that we are looking at, right? So is it pertinent? Some of the things that you could look at measuring are views of decision makers on what they feel and how they think on the issues, and the types and forms of information decision makers require that have been made available. So in other words, the greater the number of types of information that they need, is it available? Greater number of forms of it. So you can measure the number of types and forms. That might be one thing. So for example, possible targets. You might say that your goal then when you measure is that you want responses from at least 5 decision makers. So that's your minimum measurement. Anything less than that, you've missed your goal. All right, I'll give you one more here. Is the information analysis credible? So credibility. We're looking at credibility. We're measuring credibility here. The possible measures. Peer reviewers have been identified. So remember, a peer reviewer or a completed peer review would be a measure of credibility. Data analysis have been reviewed by have been peer reviewed. So how do we translate that to what we are measuring? You might say then that responses received from at least 3 peer reviewers. So again, let me relate that to the development of a research proposal for you guys. This is the reason why you find that when we talk to you about preparation of your research proposal, as well as your final proposal, we would often talk to you about the importance of including those peer reviews in your literature review, because your literature review is supposed to inform your experiment design, or in other words, your methodology. So the presence or absence of peer-reviewed articles will determine a certain level of credibility of the literature review that you've done. All right? So please take time to review the contents of the table. Now we look at opportunity management. How do we measure that? Let me see, let me look at a short one here. So the question you're looking to answer: are appropriately different outputs planned for targeting specific stakeholder groups? how can we possibly do that? What might we be wanting to measure? You might look at the number and type of unique communication opportunities for your various stakeholder groups, right? Remember, certain types of communication strategies would be better suited to certain audiences, right? Where you have a technical educated audience, you can do you can do seminars, you can do presentations, etc. Where you may have a less educated, less technical group, you may want to do consultations where you can have that two-way feedback and be able to explain things, etc., or one-on-one, right? So how many of those different types? What are you saying here? The targets or your goal, therefore, would be to measure at least one each for each of your stakeholder groups. Do you have at least one to cover each of them? That's another example of measurement. All right. So I hope by now you all are beginning to understand how you make that translation from the questions that you have to being able to determine what you will measure. Okay. Next table, this one, measuring for effective relationship management, right? So let me just take you back quickly to that earlier diagram. Relationship management here, this refers to how do you measure in the changes in the thinking and actions of the policies and policymakers. Right. So this one, make sure this second entry here, it's pretty extensive, but make sure you can at least be able to understand and quote a few examples from here. So let's pull out from here. What important changes in the thinking and actions of key decision makers have been observed? So you're looking to see if there's any information that you could pull out about the change in thinking and actions, right? So let's see. Types of receiving behavior observed. All right, such as the number of decision makers as subscribers to listserv or email newsletters. So receiving, in other words, how many persons actually showing an interest in getting more information. You might also look at the number of persons that receive and request state of the environment reports. So those are actual numbers that if you are in an agency or organization, you should be able, not should be able, but rather you should be documenting this information, and your data should provide numbers to give you some kind of idea or some kind of measure as to whether or not these people are actually getting the information. And of course, these are receiving behavior in the sense that they are on the receiving end, right? Directional. Cell phone text messages, how many of those went out? Number of PDF files downloaded from your website. You know, oftentimes websites will have counters, so you know how many people visited this site, you know how many people downloaded, etc. All right. Then there's another perspective. You can look at the types of seeking behavior. So this here is this first one is a little bit more passive, whereas the seeking behavior would be a little more active. And these are people who you would find that these are people who are motivated to get the information. So you can categorize them like that. So for example, you might look at keywords entered in search engines of the IA website by decision makers. So that is metadata information that should be available in the background for the agency. You might look at the number of targeted users, such as these key decision makers attending new types of meetings and using IEA vocabulary in interviews. So the use of the technical jargon would be an indication as to their level of understanding or increasing level of understanding. So these are just a few, all right? And it's quite interesting. So this hopefully is as I said, giving you some understanding of how you translate those questions into measurable variables or parameters. So next we want to look at measures for improvement in policy and policy making. This is a difficult task. Measurements should relate to the change statement that you identified in your impact strategy, right? So what changes? Your change statement would be like your goal, right? How have different stages in the policy making process changed, right? So you're talking about policy making here, the process of policy making. You will have a change statement, which would be the aim of your project. You want to know how have the stages changed? Have they been improved? Have these changes shown any improvement? Is the process more efficient? And are the policies more robust? So you are actually evaluating your policy making process here by being able to answer these questions. So the measures for effective relationship management, so this is related to relationship management in terms of policy making and decision makers. So measures for this might still help you better understand the role of your IEA in a higher level policy improvements. All right. So in other words, changes in policymakers' thinking may reflect in policies that are more relevant to the environmental needs. All right, so this is what you're trying to understand. The outcome, if you have improvements in the process, policy making process, and therefore improvement in the policy itself, you expect that to translate into policies that will better impact the environmental needs, right? So this is the outcome you would expect to see. Right, so remember earlier we would have made brief mention of an assessment, self-assessment. As an organization, you would need to do these self-assessments to see if you are meeting your goals and be it process or evaluation, etc. So there has to be some planning that would allow you to do that. Okay. In step 1, you would want to identify the major issues and monitoring questions and develop specific measures. So remember, we were looking at those tables. In those tables, we always see that we start with a question. So what are the questions or the issues? What do you need to monitor? All right. And so these are the things that need to be identified in step 1. Step 2, you want to identify your sources of data and data collection. So as we go through, you would realize this actually mirrors the processes that you would need to do for any research project. You have to begin with the question, research question, that gives you an idea of what you need to measure, such as defined by your objectives or criteria. Then once you've defined that, in step 2, you need to determine now, what data do I need to collect? Where is it available in order to satisfy the measurements of those specific indicators that I've identified? And finally, once you've done this part, step 2, now you need to set priorities and frequency for monitoring. So this is specific to an organization. So what is most important to measure, and how often do I measure it? So that's measuring and evaluation. Okay, so, right, so some of this here, you can just go through briefly. We have more or less covered most of what we need to understand. Some of this, again, it may actually just be a repetition here. So step 1, again, identify. So this is what we were just looking at here. So step 1, identify your major issues and monitoring questions and develop specific measures. So if it's policy you're talking about, you would have your change statement. This is what you need. This is a major issue. And what is your change statement? Your desired improvements. So your goal, desire, what do you desire your policies and policy processes to show or to do? Also coming out of the outcomes for policy development, you want to ensure that you have effective relationship management. So how do you know that? You know that by finding or identifying ways to measure, have the thinking and the actions of your policy makers and decision makers change for the better? We talked about that. We looked at a few measures and indicators already, right? Activities and outputs, we looked at that. Knowledge, opportunities, communication, and then of course, timely completion. Are you meeting your deadlines as had been initially designed or identified, right? So all of this is this is planning for your step one. Remember we talked about step one in the planning assessment here. Okay. Here we have this is just an example of a matrix that can be utilized for a self-assessment. Notice what we have here. We have the IA process. Remember, there were 7 steps. We have these listed here as our major phases or criteria. For each of those, we see we've identified specific issues or questions that we would like to be able to answer. For each question, the next column for each question here, what you would do is you will identify the specific indicators that you would like to measure. Once you've identified those issues or indicators that you would like to measure, you then identify the source of that data. Okay, where is it? Where would you collect that? What is there a particular sample population you have to look at? Where they're available, etc. And then you will have to determine, okay, what method am I going to use to collect that information? So is it, let's say, decision makers at in a particular sector, decision makers in a particular sector, let's say the energy sector. All right, that's the source of your information. You need to identify your sample population there. Then you may decide, okay, how am I going to measure it? What method of data collection? I may determine, okay, I need to do a combination of questionnaires and interviews. Okay, so again, hopefully you see the logical progression from column 1 here all the way to this final column, data collection. So continuing to talk about data sources and data collection methods, we are now actually on step 2. We just had an overview of the whole issue that we were just looking at in that table. So here we really have just a list, and of course, by no means an exhaustive list of data collection methods. So we know we have questionnaire surveys. Those questionnaire surveys would normally collect quantitative data, right? Because remember, they will be producing and deriving numeric data for you that you'll be able to statistically analyze. So these would usually be those close-ended questions. Then you can have face-to-face interviews in the online environment. Of course, you know, you can conduct online interviews. You would have telephone interviews, etc. These again, these would be qualitative data collection methods. All right, because oftentimes you may have semi-structured interview questions prepared, so they would be prepared beforehand, but oftentimes it would be open-ended because you want to give respondents the flexibility to produce as much information, to give you as much information as possible. Additionally, you have group techniques where you can You can have group interviews, you can have workshops, focus group discussions. This is, so those would be much smaller in number. Also, since we're talking about sample size and smaller in number, please note that when you conduct questionnaire surveys, those sample sizes will tend to be much larger than interviews, focus groups, etc. And then, of course, you also have document review, which would produce a qualitative type data collection. All right, so this is where you may review documents, reports, etc. for information. All right. So let's now talk about collecting data for monitoring effective relationship management. Okay, again, so we're going back to this topic again. We looked at an earlier slide where we saw some examples of measure. So this requires that changes in behavior be identified and mapped. These incremental changes will lead toward the decisions or changes that you are seeking. So remember, you have outcomes. You want to see better policies and impacts on the improved impacts on the environment. So this can be a time-intensive process. So it is important to set up simple ways to monitor your strategy against those measures. So again, I refer you back to the table that looks specifically at this, where you see some examples of what you can measure. You can set up small contact databases where you can keep notes. So like with a journaling function, so that if you get emails or phone calls from these individuals, you can actually, add little notes and have them in your database. Right, and finally, step 3, we're still talking about self-assessment, set priorities and frequency of monitoring and evaluation. So you want to ensure that critical indicators are monitored. So you've already identified your measures, indicators, those measures that you want to be collecting data for. So you want to ensure that they are being monitored. You want to establish the frequency of monitoring for each indicator. So note here we have 2 categories of indicators. We have process indicators and we have progress indicators. So process indicators, we need to be monitoring this throughout the entire IEA process, right? The specific things that you're monitoring throughout the process, whereas we have progress indicators. You don't need them as much, so you don't need to be monitoring as frequently, but you need them long after the IEA, is complete, because this is basically you want to know if you have met or if you are in process of meeting your ultimate goal, right? So this would be similar to what we talked about, where at strategic phases throughout the process to know if you are on your way to meeting your goal. Right, so questions for monitoring meetings. So if you have, these meetings would be an important part of your monitoring, right? So you're not only measuring environmental or, those kind of passive variables, but remember you're talking about policy making as well, all right? That means that people are involved. So some of the questions that you would need to be able to answer to know if you are progressing in your goal would be, what are the most revealing lessons for you at this stage? Because remember, one of your goals is to build capacity and improve the process. Okay. Also, how can you use this knowledge and an attitude to improve the next stages process, outputs and targeted changes? Have you achieved what you planned for this stage? If yes, what factors helped? If not, what factors hindered? So these are all questions really, when you look at it, that allow you to make that evaluation for capacity building. Again, this slide is here for you to look at and consider every question. So at this point, I would like to thank you for joining me for today's lesson. Please refer to eClassroom for the activity assigned for this lesson. Thank you.